on the one hand, I am fully on board when it comes to this pursuit of grounding normativity and values in or at the most basic level of what it means to be a living creature, and so I am in line with this idea of life, norms, continuity, or even in some sense identity. And I've been doing some work in this area, although from a very specific perspective, namely I've been trying to come up with what I call the ontological foundations of embodied cognition, and especially of a certain kind of enactivism, the Varelian kind of enactivism, and the very notion of enactment as a very specific and crucial concept. So this is one thing, but the other thing is that just last week, actually, I participated in a social ontology conference on the other side of the world, and it is quite funny because from their perspective, from the perspective of, maybe not all, but most of the people participating in this conference, their reaction to what we are doing here today would be like, what is it all about? I mean, how can you even try to talk about norms without mentioning, this whole political sphere, the struggle for power, and how authoritarianism is back, and Trump is bad, and so on and so forth. And right now, this is my environment, I can say, my niche. Namely, right now I'm working on certain things having to do with institutions, theory of institutions. It's on the borderline, let's say, between social ontology and institutional economics. So from a certain perspective, I am right now a parachuter, let's say, from this social ontology platform, but somehow Sebastian finds it appropriate for me to be here, so I'm here, and this is a great pleasure. So, despite being this parachuter.
We are all asking ourselves, why does he find it appropriate? I am here.
Exactly. I share this feeling. So, however mind-split I am, I would like to avoid the two extremes. One being, or saying that if you want to philosophize about norms, you need to bring all these things having to do with beliefs, full-blown intentional states, basically meaning propositional states, and struggle for power, politics, and all that stuff. And the other extreme being that if we somehow deal with the normativity at the level of bacterial chemotaxis, then we know everything we should know, and basically there is a short line from that point to the social level and to this political sphere and everything else. And I'm not claiming that anyone in this room goes with this other extreme, but there are some signs of it. Like, for example, in the niche construction literature, you have some people, very clever people, doing this kind of leap between niches of beavers, and from that point they make this huge leap to cultural niches, virtual niches online, and so on and so forth. And this is super interesting and informative, but what I would say is that we need, let's say, at least a couple of steps in between. And so what I'm trying to do, what I will be trying to deliver today is a very, let me emphasize this, very coarse-grained picture of at least some of these steps in between, and still stressing the fact that I'm this parachuter from the social ontology stuff. So this is exactly what I'm doing right now, and I will indicate these points at which we have, like I said, we will have some hints at what I'm doing right now. Okay, so let's begin this thing. So as we all know, and basically the first part of my presentation is full with things you already know, so please forgive me because these are just obvious things and some definitions. So from the, broadly speaking, an activist perspective, I'm not very concerned with names here. Somebody may like or dislike the term an activism or an active approach or the so-called 4E or whatever. So according to what we can broadly understand as the embodied cognition / an activism, it tells us that organisms cast a web of significance, as we are told here, on the world. And so each individual creature is an ontological center that imbues interactions with the environment with significance they do not have in its absence. And this is like, I agree with that, and I believe that we all agree with that point. So this refers to this basic level non-indifference, or very broadly speaking, positiveness or negativeness of things or events, from the perspective of individual autonomy. Now, the question is, how do values and norms, somehow having to do with these values, emerge on this ground? Because the anthropocentric extreme would say that in order to philosophize about values and norms, we need this whole baggage of propositional attitudes. But the problem they have is that, okay, so where do these propositional attitudes actually come from? Evolutionary speaking, is it just a miracle or what? So this is a huge problem, and actually nobody has any answer to that. So when I ask about the emergence, what is somehow encrypted in this very question is this idea that there is a kind of evolution here, and we need to unpack at least some of the moments, crucial moments in this evolution. So, and now what I mean by values and norms. So first of all, I don't want to speak that much about values as abstract entities, somehow abstracted entities. I would rather tend to speak about value-ness, if there is such a word in English, perhaps somebody might correct me, which is some kind of experienced quality of something, in some sense affording something to us, like calling for specific actions. And so, for example, we can experience the difference between this stone and the sheep, because we can experience the value of the life of this sheep, or the inherent dignity of this sheep. And I'm not mentioning this poor sheep right now just in an attempt to be funny. I mean it seriously. So this is like an experience of a valuable entity, meaning entity simply a part of the world, not in some bad sense of the term entity. However, and this is the anthropocentric aspect of my approach, let's say, if we have values, we are, and this is inherent, I mean this is like a constitutive feature of values in this approach, that we can ignore the call. We can ignore the value. Somehow we can be blind to the value, or intentionally ignore the value, or ignore this call. And of course, it may come with consequences if, like for example, our conscience might be a kind of consequence of that, or the voice coming from our conscience should be a consequence. But still, we can do that. Now, when it comes to norms, which basically means social norms, it's an addition which is perhaps obvious and perhaps not, but in this context it should be added. These are practical or behavioral realizations of this experienced value-ness of something. So we can think of them as certain behavioral patterns, and it can be formalized in some game theoretic terms, but it's enough for us here to speak of certain behavioral patterns. And once again, we are free and we are capable, this is quite crucial here, to break a norm. And we also will pay the price. Like, for example, some kind of sanction is usually attributed to the norm. So we will pay the price, but we can do it. And now the question is, to what extent, let me put it this way, at what level of the evolution of normativity this capacity for breaking norms emerges? And I have absolutely no position about this thing. However, it's not that obvious that this capacity is like already there at the simplest level. I believe it's not. It emerges at some point. Now, of course, it's a theoretical and empirical question. What that point is? So, and here is a hint towards to what I'm doing right now. These norms. They create institutions, or even according to some people, institutions are identical with specific norms. And a certain theory of institutions is exactly the topic of my current research project. And here is a narcissistic advertisement, namely what I'm going to say is already available in especially the paper on the left, and when it comes to the paper, more recent paper on the right, here I provide some kind of an activism-inspired account of institutions and norms. So this is this narcissistic part. If you want to take a picture, of course. Now it can be even more narcissistic. Okay, so let's start with these obvious definitions that you all know, okay? And of course you can question all of them because there are many definitions on the market of these concepts. So let's begin from the very beginning, which means who is the agent when it comes to these behavioral patterns or norms as behavioral patterns. And the agent is, of course, some exemplification of autonomous system. And the autonomous system, and for a given system, according to this definition, for a given system to be autonomous, means to follow the following condition. It is realized within a specific domain, what I call the base, which is we can be naive about it and say that this is the physical stuff, okay? And its components are recursively dependent on each other. It maintains boundaries. The issue of boundaries was at some point very important to me, a kind of ontology of boundaries, but this is not that much important here. It is unique, and this is not something we usually have in the definition of an autonomous system, but I would add that, and for a specific reason. And of course, the DNA is like one realization or exemplification of this idea of uniqueness here. And what is crucial is that actually the very idea of uniqueness makes sense only with respect to living creatures. Because, well, in principle at least, each of them is in some sense unique. So you did not have any uniqueness in the universe prior to the emergence of life, which is quite striking if we think of it. And now the system determines all possible interactions with entities in the system's environment. Okay, so now the question is what this environment is all about. And of course, if we, in one way or another, follow the enactivist literature, and we are in this spirit, and I am in this particular respect in this spirit, environment cannot be understood as just what is surrounding the system. It cannot be thought of as some kind of external reality, because the boundary between the internal and the external is one of the things that are actually enacted over this process. So that's why it's not that fundamental that it's external. So we need some concept of an environment, what it means for a domain to be the environment of a particular system. And here we have this idea of structural coupling, which may help us, and perhaps we can rearrange these notions so the way in which structural coupling has to do with sense making and codetermination might be different, I believe, but just for the sake of this presentation and for the paper I mentioned, I decided to arrange these concepts in this particular way, namely that we have this structural coupling, when we have sense making, and when we have this codetermination. I will not read this stuff because we can assume safely, I believe, that you are perfectly familiar with this thing. And now, so being a particular domain serving as the environment of a system means that the system is structurally coupled with this domain, and that the system is involved in the process of sense making in this particular domain, and so on and so forth. So then another piece of this puzzle that we need is cognition, of course, and it is also perfectly familiar, I believe, that from the perspective that we adopt here, cognition is not some kind of internal processing, but as Varela and collaborators famously put it, cognition is not the representation of a pre-given world by a pre-given mind, but it's rather the enactment of the world and a mind on the basis of a history of the variety of actions. And now, of course, this is the most controversial concept here, which is the concept of enactment. And actually, even some people in the enactivist literature, somehow they are trying to navigate their way around this concept. And I mean, I can understand that for certain practical reasons if a particular research project has nothing to do with enactment. But when we want to, let's say, capture the core of the idea, in my understanding, the concept of enactment is there. It's in the very heart of what Varela, Thompson, and Roche wanted to deliver in the great book. And I've spent some time trying to, let's say, approach this controversial notion of enactment from many different perspectives, from the perspective of niche construction, from some other perspectives. But this is the crucial thing, and it breaks the Cartesian internal versus external dualism, because cognition is approached here as a genuinely creative process, meaning that the world becomes, or it comes about over the process of cognition, perception in particular. I was interested in perception, but cognition more generally. It's quite a revolutionary idea compared to the standard Cartesian picture of the internal versus external and mapping one from the perspective of the other. Okay, but this is not so much crucial here. I mean, diving into the details of this concept is not that much significant here. Now we have this concept of participatory sense making, which is the next piece of this whole puzzle, and of course it comes from the famous paper from 2007 by Hanne de Jager and Ezequiel Di Paolo. And in my somewhat reformulation, we have a group of autonomous systems, and they are involved in participatory sense making if each member of the group, acting in the sake of its own sense making, coordinates its behavior with the behaviors of others in such a way that the emergent group behavior changes the course of this individual sense making, and therefore it impacts the pursuit of maintaining autonomy. And we can have, you might say, a richer conception of participatory sense making. So, but this is enough, I mean, at least for the sake of this talk. Okay, now, here is the thing that I find quite crucial, namely what I refer to as the productivity of sense making. So what I mean here is that sense making is not just a process, something that is going on, let's say a huge act or a series of acts. It may be a series of acts. It's about doing things eventually. But the key thing for me as an ontologist is that it is productive in the sense that a certain domain is produced by these acts. And here I refer to the very standard and traditional act-product distinction introduced by Kazimierz Twardowski from the Brentanian school. It's very intuitive, but also quite tricky, ontologically speaking. So So there is the process of painting and a painting as the product of this process, and there is a process of writing a poem and the poem as the product of this process. And you can say certain things about the poem which are completely irrelevant when it comes to the process of writing a poem. So having this ontological mindset, from my perspective, it is crucial what is produced by sense-making. And the idea is, and there are some hints in the very text, that there is something, some domain produced by sense-making. So I propose that we have higher level autonomous system, and they are like, they satisfy the basic definition, and they include basic level, or let's say basic level autonomous systems as proper parts, and the participating autonomous system are involved in the process of participatory sense making. And of course, this idea of higher level, of a certain hierarchy of autonomous systems is already on the market, and most famously perhaps, or well, yeah, traditionally and perhaps most famously in the works of Niklas Luhmann, for example. So it's already on the market. It's not my idea, but I would emphasize this for the sake of what is going to be presented in my on my next slides. So we have this productivity, and yeah, so participatory sense making is productive in the sense that it is a necessary condition for the emergence of a certain higher level autonomous system, of a certain domain, let's say. And now we can understand environment as this product, enacted environment as the product of this process of participatory sense making, as a higher level autonomous system. Now, and here is the key thing for my current research project, and this is like a point of connection between my current research project in social ontology and my former attempts to do something in the field of embodied cognition / enactivism. So there is this notion of problem domain, and Barrera, Thompson, and Roche, as they have a very great passage in which they write that a species brings forth and specifies its own domain of problems to be solved. This domain does not exist out there in an environment that acts as a landing pad for organisms that somehow drop or parachute into the world. So this is the key thing here, that some of these enacted higher level autonomous system, meaning some of the environments, satisfy an additional condition, or perhaps someone might argue that it is inherent to any environment, but I would say that this is an additional condition that must be satisfied for the environment to be or to become a problem domain. And this is like a crucial thing. Okay, I will say about it a little bit later. Okay, so here is just a provisional definition. So suppose we have this higher level autonomous system, which means we have a certain environment, and there is a certain demand in it. So I need to do something, let's say, or the organism needs to do something to achieve a certain goal. And of course, this demand is determined by the autonomy conditions. And now the point is that this environment is a problem domain if there is more than one, it's a simplification of course, but formally speaking, more than one possible behavioral pattern leading to the satisfaction of this demand. So if I want to get out, I can take this path or a path around. So there are at least two ways to do the thing. If there is only one way to do the thing, it makes no sense to speak of a problem to be solved. So there must be more than one. And so now, for example, I have a problem, how to get out of this room, and I can do it this way or that way, or perhaps navigate somehow through, push through the chairs. But anyway, this is a problem. If there is only one determined way to do certain things, somehow you might say biologically determined or physically determined or in any way determined, it makes no sense to speak of problems. Okay, and now here is the key thing actually. The notion of problematization. And, well, right now I'm trying to build a lot on this concept of problematization in the work I'm doing in social ontology. So, actually we can ask, where does the demand come from? So we can think at least of a situation in which the autonomous system is not aware, so to speak. I don't want to assume any full-blown consciousness here, but in some sense aware of a certain demand, or perhaps it's not the case. I mean, if we have a demand, we need to be aware of these demands. So I don't want to make any claim regarding that issue, especially at this basic level, which is something you are all interested in. But at the social level, it is by no means obvious that certain objective, you might say, conditions in the world constitute problems to be solved. And now someone might claim that this is like absurd because it's only, you need to just look around and you have problems everywhere. But it is by no means crucial how we are able to take something as a problem to be solved, to take something, to cognize something as an opportunity to be taken, as a potential goal, or something calling for a specific action. And there are historical examples of societies capable of addressing certain things in their physical environment as problems to be solved and as opportunities. Like having access to an open sea is an opportunity, but you need to see it as an opportunity. And it's not that much, it's not that obvious. I mean, you have to see it in a specific way. So this is what I call problematization. And now there is a question of how this problematization is realized at the individual level, and of course as a cognitive capacity, and also how this problematization is realized at the social level, if we take it as a capacity attributable to collectives. How we can do it collectively, how we can do it together, or fail to do that together. And the latter is perhaps even more interesting, because we can learn something from these failures. So this is this issue of problematization, and actually I didn't want to talk much about that, but this movie about the beetle and the sheep ball is a great illustration of that, because actually we can, and I have no answer to this question, but I would ask, is it the case that the beetle problematized the stick as a new problem to be solved, or rather, eventually the beetle succeeded in rolling the ball, but my impression, at least from the movie, was that it was achieved by implementing the same strategy, which at some point just worked. But perhaps you can debate with that. But here is, let's say, it's not that obvious whether the beetle problematized this stick as something to be solved, as a problem to be solved. So even at this level, we can see that this is by no means obvious. How we take our environment, how certain elements of the environment constitute problems. And why I'm actually bringing this up, because in my view of these steps between the simplest and the more complex social normativity, we need a point at which we have problem domains and we have collective attempts to solve these problems, and then some kind of more like anthropocentric normativity emerges. But if we are about to talk about these, let's say, for the sake of this talk, anthropocentric normativity, then we need to be able to talk about problem domains. We need to introduce this concept explicitly. If we are to introduce this concept of a problem domain explicitly, at some level, I don't have any position at which level actually it emerges, we need to deal with this, let's say, I believe that we need to deal with this problem of problematization. Yeah, sounds weird, but okay. Okay, so as I said, problematization is all about making a familiar phenomenon, like this sheep ball, into an issue, let's say. So both the stick and the shit ball was pretty familiar to the beetle, I believe, in its environment, but somehow together it constituted a problem. And now the question is whether the beetle was able to actually problematize this thing. And so problem domains need to be enacted by some specific acts of participatory sense-making in this approach, and so problematization as such is a specific act of sense-making. Okay, and now the interesting thing, I mean, all of these things are interesting, but now we can make a particularly interesting step forward. Namely, in a more recent paper by Hanne de Jager, she introduces this notion of loving as letting be. And this is a very interesting paper, and I would skip the loving part, not because I'm not sentimental and I don't like this part, but just for the sake of brevity, so to speak, I will focus on this letting be part. However, our emotionality is a crucial part of this whole thing if we are to provide a whole or more comprehensive story. So here is a nice quote. The point is that in the engagement of knowing, and perhaps in many other engagements, not only knowing, I would like take it more broadly, the process events and beings that the knower knows balance between being themselves and being as they are known. That is, they are determined in part by themselves and in part by the knower's being. They are never fully self-determined and never fully other-determined, always dialectically evolving between determinations. This is what letting be is, an ongoing, moving, dialectical balancing between the being of the knower and the being of the known. Whew. Thank you for that remark. And so this also applies to how we deal with one another, how autonomous systems like human beings deal with one another. And the idea is here that if we have, let's say, a set of autonomous systems acting in a fixed problem domain, and this is the notion of problem domain here reappears as an important factor, we can say that the behavior of the autonomous system A1 is determined by another autonomous system A2, let's say, if the range of possible courses of individual action available to A2 decreases as a result of specific actions taken by the other agent. So if I can have freedom to choose this way and that way, and for some reason, because of the actions taken by Sebastian, for example, I need to take this path, this means that I'm determined. And now the key thing is this balance between a complete lack of determination, which is like do whatever you like. So the radical Dostoevskian scenario, let's say, we can do whatever, and the over-determination, you might say, when everything is like in a totalitarian system, let's say. Okay, so this is the idea. And now, so there is this notion of letting be. So, to summarize this thing, how much time do I have?
I think you have 10 minutes.
Okay, should be good. To summarize this thing, we have problem domains, we have autonomous systems acting in problem domains in order to solve certain problems. And now, as part of this pursuit of solving specific problems in a specific enacted domain, the domain is not just there, let me emphasize this fact again, although it's perhaps obvious to you. When we act together as in the pursuit of solving a specific problem, there is a risk of under-determination when everybody does something and actually there is a visible goal in that, because the very existence of the problem is a certain determination, and over-determination when we have this like totalitarian structure in which the behavior of every single individual system is somehow framed or fully determined by the behaviors of others. And now, we need to navigate between these two extremes, De Jager says, and building on that idea, I would say that we also need certain environment. So we are climbing up once again. We need a certain environment built on the basis of our problem domains, a new entity, once again, a higher level autonomous system, in which abstaining from overdetermination, especially, I skipped the underdetermination part here, is doable. It is not that obvious that the environment in which we act enables us to avoid this path of overdetermination. Perhaps there are some pathological examples of environments, and some political systems, for example, in which it is impossible to avoid this scenario of overdetermination. So the question is, what kind of environment is welcoming to our attempts not to overdetermine the behavior of others? Okay? So, as I said, as I put it here, that problem domains in which the individual, the question here refers to such problem domains in which the individuality or the uniqueness, this is why I emphasize this point, of individual problem solvers can manifest itself in a way that is beneficial to the overall process of problem solving. So we have this issue of what factors make it possible for problem solvers to navigate between underdetermination and overdetermination and avoiding both extremes. So I would say that there must be certain patterns at this higher level. I would say that they are like meta patterns, framing somehow the patterns on the lower level and making it possible for the collective to avoid overdetermination. So these are higher level patterns, which are patterns of dealing with these lower level behavioral patterns. I know it's like not very well said, but I hope that you can at least grasp the main thought here. Sorry for this very convoluted formulation. So the idea is that these meta patterns are crucial for balancing and for the pursuit of avoiding overdetermination to become stabilized as a kind of social practice. And the question is how we can stabilize this lack of overdetermination as a social practice, how it can be achieved. And the stabilization here means that this balance between overdetermination and underdetermination is not just a momentary thing, but it is like a pattern of patterns. Okay, and now it is especially when, if someone is familiar, for example, with the management literature, it is even obvious. Because there are many management strategies, and one of the management strategies is like a hierarchical structure with someone who is on top of that structure deciding basically on everything. And we can also think of more flattened governance structures or management structures in which people are allowed to do their thing and somehow they are coordinated by the managers so that when they do their thing, their own thing, and they all deal with a very complex problem, they can somehow collectively come to a certain conclusion. But each of the individuals do their own thing. And this actually works, and perhaps this is the only thing that works when it comes to really complex, extremely complex problems. So this is just, let's say, an analogy. Okay, so now the thing is that if enactment is something present at each level, then the question is, what is enacted by these higher level patterns enabling us to avoid overdetermination or underdetermination? What is enacted by it? What kind of extra domain, one more domain, is enacted by this pursuit of patterned lack of overdetermination especially? So my idea is that it is what I would call very provisionally an axiological domain, which is a relatively stable realm, a higher level autonomous system enacted by systems that are capable of solving complex problems in their environments by implementing the letting be strategy. And the core feature of this realm is the fact that the individuals are able to deal with what the Jäger refers to as balancing between underdetermination and overdetermination. And now norms are represented by, I'm not saying that norms are behavioral patterns or meta patterns. This is not a reductive ontological claim, but a more, you might say, a safer claim that when we speak about norms, they may be represented by these behavioral meta patterns inside the axiological domain. Then what I call vehicles of values, which means valuable things in the world. That's why I'm maybe not skeptical, but I'm not that in rush to speak about values as abstract entities, but rather about things somehow projecting valueness, which I call technically here, like in analogy to truth, vehicles. They may be called vehicles of values. So valuable entities are distinguishable parts of this axiological domain. And values themselves are somehow abstracted factors, somehow distinguishable within the particular axiological domain. So it doesn't mean that they are like created off the top of my head. They are somehow encrypted in the domain, but they need to be abstracted by our cognition. Whereas what is really in the domain is these things projecting the valueness on us. And we are projecting it, let's say, on one another. So this is the basic thing here. And so I should conclude, I believe.
Slowly, yes.
So someone might, of course, argue that, okay, but still, I don't understand why this is like an axiological domain, which means the domain of values. So, because the connection between these, such a simple or even simplistic model, if you like, and our real life full of different valuable things and events, and it's like huge, it is still a huge distance. So I promised you a couple of bridging steps, let's say, and what we actually get here is nothing like that, but we are still at this very abstract and very simple level. So I'm afraid I don't have a good and compelling answer to that, but my intuition is that when we talk about values, that values or valueness is somehow built on the ground of this idea of letting the thing be what it is, so to speak, on its own right. It's like, of course, an additional conceptual framework when I speak of rights, but just to make it more intuitive, of course, just for this sake. So, an axiological domain is a domain in which a thing, an entity, a whatever, can stand and be like let alone, so to speak, for its own position. These are all, of course, very imperfect attempts to make this idea intuitive. And on this ground, somehow what we call values from our anthropocentric perspective, they somehow are built up on this ground. But if we agree at least provisionally that this story makes at least some sense, possibly, perhaps, we can, and this is my last slide, we can approach some traditional philosophical troubles having to do with values somewhat anew from this perspective. So perhaps this is the reason why it is something to develop. So the axiological domain is not decoupled from the base, which means the physical stuff around us, or the whatever stuff around us, if you don't like to call it physical. Actually, I don't like, but we need to call it somehow. So It's not decoupled from that, but it's a higher level autonomous, as a higher level autonomous system built on that ground, it cannot be reduced to this base. So the base is still there, but the axiological domain cannot be reduced to this base, and we cannot be like reductionist saying that all there is are elementary particles and that's the end of the story, we can go home. Right? Okay, not necessarily. Secondly, the entities, as I put it here, engaged in the production of this axiological domain, which means autonomous system, they owe their status as parts of the system to the process of this shared or participatory enactment of this axiological domain, which means that we reaffirm one another or one another's status as vehicles of valueness. If we are all parts of this axiological domain, which somewhat goes against this individual versus collectivism strife. So it is not the case that the individual has its own value, like completely dependently of the whole network. But on the other hand, it is equally untrue from this perspective that the only valuable thing is the collective and the individual with all its like liberal rights is completely irrelevant. No, we are somewhere in between, we are somewhere on the middle ground here. At least there is a chance to find oneself on this middle ground. Thirdly, this reproduction of the axiological domain can be interpreted as giving rise to what we might call the objectivity of values, meaning that values are not objective in the sense that it is a value in this chair and that's it. It's like its property, like its color or whatever. Well, colors are pretty controversial. But anyway, it's not just in the chair, but it is also not something I just make up. It's not off the top of my head. It's not just, let's say, a momentary product of my mood or my mental life more generally or whatever. It is a relatively stable product of this intersubjective pursuit of shared enaction of our problem domains. And the last point, the last point is that, and this account of axiological domain is the ground on which I would like to build a certain conception of what I call situated institutions, which means also norms, and on the more practical side of it, how the shape of our situated institutions historically impacted economic growth and the accumulation of wealth and this kind of stuff from economic history, which is an extremely interesting thing. Okay, I believe that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions?
You've spoken mostly about the being seeing its environment as problematic. I wonder, can the being see itself as problematic? Just one question.
But once again, sorry, but
you spoke mostly about there being a being that sees its environment as a kind of problematic situation. It problematizes its environmental situation.
Yeah.
Can it problematize itself? Well, what would that entail in your system? And the third question, what role would culture, as this sphere of human culture, play in regards to these axiological domains that you speak about?
Yeah, so when it comes to the first question, I believe that this would be something like self-alienation, I don't know how to name it. But Paul Ricoeur, I believe, had this book titled, I don't know what is the title in English, but exactly. So this is the book when I take me as the other, so to speak. So when I problematize myself, somehow I distance myself from myself for the sake of this particular problematization. But given the fact that I am part of my environment, there is no like clear-cut distinction that right now I'm focused solely on my own issues, let's say, and completely ignore the environment. You can draw these boundaries between the individual system and its environment in many different ways, actually. And this also applies to problematization. So, in pursuit of problematization, I can draw these lines also differently, and perhaps for some problems I see in myself, to put it simplistically, the environment is less important, and for some other problems it is like crucial, but it's still there. For sure, it's still there. But qualitatively, it's, I believe, the same thing. So perhaps this is like a more controversial claim, that whether I problematize this thing, or I problematize my own arm, or problematize something in my mental life, qualitatively these are similar acts of problematization. So this is one thing. When it comes to culture, I would say that I have an issue with this notion because especially economic historians usually refer to culture when they want to refer to a very loosely defined setup of different factors responsible for why a particular group of people is capable of doing something, willing to do something, whereas some other people are not necessarily that much willing to do something, even something beneficial. So there may be an opportunity, as seen from the perspective of the observer, external observer. Somehow the community, faced with this opportunity, supposedly just doesn't want to see it, is not willing to see it, or is unable to see it for some reasons, perhaps structural or institutional reasons. So, and some of them define culture as well, but this is like a tricky thing, the concept of culture, in the literature that I'm familiar with. My answer would be that, very simplistic, that culture is built on the ground of axiological domains which are evolutionary older than culture. Something like that.
Okay, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. That was a pleasure. And very, very clear. And there are many, many things which I like to talk about, but I also will get to the problematization thing. I'm very grateful for you to raise this. And this merits even their own publications, because I think you really touched one of the hidden root metaphors we are dealing with here, which is this Salesian natural state. That there is basically our existence as such is somehow a strive, is somehow always menace, it is a problem. And it's beautiful your question, actually, why is it a problem? Why must it be a problem? And then I find it very very convincing to pull in the Hanne Jäger's idea. And so I just want to draw two more connections. One, I want to draw again to the mother value of all values, which has been repeatedly quoted as being about survival. And that's so it's actually about solving a problem. And this is not meant to be like this by Jonas, I'm really sure. It is meant as something else. When the mother value, der Urwert aller Werte, is life saying yes to itself. It's not a problem solution. It's an emphatic act saying yes. You could even say, like twisting it slightly, you could say it's a sort of enjoying to let myself be. That's the mother value of all values. So it's not about survival, and it somehow has gotten this twist because we're in this Hobbesian environment still, that actually there's this profound problem which everything is about to solve, and maybe not. And so I find this very valuable, and this of course, I mean, I understand that you can look at some profound problems in you, because these problems have mostly been looked at through this Hobbesian lens, and if you look through another lens, they somehow stop being problems. And one more hint is that, of course, letting be is a Buddhist notion. That is the goal. It's the goal. It's even it's the primary content of the pointing out instruction you receive by your teachers, to see that, to let be, and to realize. That's very interesting. Don't forget that Werner was, at the time he did all this, the research you're referring to. He was a practitioner of Dzogchen practice. So he went to Nepal every year for a month in order to be allowed, be given by his teacher to understand that actually, if he let be, the teacher made this somehow, then he understood that he was simply the world from a certain perspective. That was the understanding. So this now I'm talking about an experience. Let's say an experience engendered from a mystical training, maybe you can call it like this. But it is an experience which has a conceptual value. And this is, again, completely free from any problem solving. It is the opposite of problem solving. And if you hear him speaking about this, it is just the opposite of problem solving. It's like, okay, actually, truly all problems are solved. There is no problem at all. There's just letting be. Very interesting.
Yeah, so two things. One is that I didn't want to make any statement regarding whether or not problematization as such is like an inherent quality of life itself, or perhaps it evolved at some point. So I'm not sure whether we should say that survival is a problem to be solved from the very get-go, from the beginning of life itself, or survival is not a problem to be solved, but there is some kind of we need a different frame or conceptual frame, whatever it might be, and problems actually emerge at some level of cognitive sophistication. Let's say. I don't have any position. Quite honestly, I'm not dodging the question, but I don't really have any position at this point. But it might be the case that problematization, in some sense, is an essential quality of life. I'm open to that, but it's not up to me to decide. In the sense that, in some sense, it's a theoretical question, of course. But in some way, it also needs to take into account some empirical data from people who actually study this thing, like cognitive evolution, for example, or the emergence of life and so on. So I just don't feel competent enough to make any statement regarding this point. But this is an option, let's say, that survival is already a problem to be solved. And the same applies to cognition, of course. Whether we have cognition, life, identity, or continuity. These are two actually different things. When it comes to your second remark, I am aware of that, and I would perhaps just broaden the perspective. So I would say that it is, and from a purely secular perspective, I might say that it is part of many religious and spiritual traditions. This notion of letting be as meaning let someone else or something else do the stuff, and letting be understood as a kind of acceptance. So something happens to me, and exactly as you said, it should constitute a problem to be solved, but somehow I decide to perhaps give in or give up and just accept something that is just happening. And this is in Buddhism, of course, and this is also in the biblical tradition. And after all, Adam and Eve are enabled to commit a sin. And at this specific point, they can do their own stuff. So this is the notion of letting be. When it comes to the concept of acceptance, of course, we have this whole Christian message, like the cross is something that we need to accept. And it was not easy even for Jesus himself, as we know from all the Gospels. So this is a struggle, therefore. And so I believe it is part of our spiritual traditions in plural. And we need to actually be aware of that and don't be afraid of not mixing, but putting the scientific and the philosophical and the spiritual more broadly, somehow putting them closer to one another, so that they can inspire one another, as it was the case in Varela. That's why. That's why this book is so strange, and that's why this book is so fascinating.
Yeah.
But I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks again.